Welcome to everybody who's joined us for the webinar this morning. This is our second run of this webinar, backed by popular demand. I think after the last one that we held, we had lots more questions coming through, so we thought it would be a good idea to have a rerun. So welcome. I'm going to introduce Ben Grunberg, partner at Grunberg & Co. Ben's going to cover the changes to the coronavirus job retention scheme. This relates back to the changes that were announced by the Chancellor a couple of weeks ago now, and relates in the main to some of the changes that come in around flexible furlough and the calculations associated around that. So I'll hand over to Ben. We will take questions at the end of Ben's presentation. So if you use the Q&A panel on your Zoom toolbar, please put any questions you'd like answered in there, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can before we finish off today. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Jo, and morning, everyone. As Jo mentioned, we're rerunning this webinar because it's clearly quite a complex area, and the changes in the calculations and the scheme that's coming into effect from tomorrow really has confused a lot of people, and we think it's important to clarify what's changing when and what you can do about it. So coming into effect in terms of the changes, what's changing when? The scheme is now closed to new entrants, and by that it means that you can't furlough any employee as of tomorrow who hasn't previously been furloughed. And for them to have previously been furloughed, they would have had to have been furloughed for the minimum of 3-week period. So in essence, if an employee has not been put on furlough from the 10th of June, they're not entitled to be furloughed anymore. Again, if you furloughed someone back in March or in April, they can be brought back onto furlough going forward. Even if they've been brought back to work, they can be put back onto furlough. But if you have never furloughed them before the 10th of June, then they can no longer be furloughed. 30th of June is the last day of the original furlough scheme, and furlough is still going on. It's just changing to this flexible furlough arrangement, and the calculations are changing, some nuances there. But in essence, any periods which may straddle the 30th of June, you will now have to do 2 calculations or 2 submissions, one for the 30th of June period and one from the 1st of July onwards. So that might impact those people who are on a 5-week, 4-week pay period, such as retail and hospitality. But most people who are paying on a monthly basis won't really have much impact. For those periods, the furlough periods before the 30th of June, you have until the 31st of July to make those submissions. After that, you no longer get the ability to claim those rebates, and you will only be able to claim rebates for the periods from 1st of July onwards. The main change as of the 1st of July is that employers are allowed to bring back their employees on a flexible furlough arrangement. And by that, the revenue really has given some real flexibility to this. In essence, you can bring back an employee based on the number of hours worked as opposed to number of days. So if you want them to work 1.5 hours, 3 hours a day, you can do that, as opposed to ensuring that they work 1 day out of the 5-day week. It's really up to you. Obviously, the new arrangements is again a change in contractual terms, and much like when you put an employee on furlough for the first time, to put an employee on a flexible furlough arrangement, you would have to agree this with them via a mutually agreed change in contractual terms. That change needs to ensure its agreement is consistent with employment, equality and discrimination laws. You need to keep a record of that for 5 years, and keep a record of how many hours they work and how many hours they're on furlough during this flexible period. Now, the revenue expect, and it's probably best practice to, as part of this change in agreement, to agree with the employee how many days they will be working or how many days they will be on furlough, or hours even, whilst they're on this flexible arrangement. For example, as of tomorrow, you could agree that an employee is working 2 days a week. In a couple of weeks' time, that might be increased to 3 days a week, 4 days a week, and then full time. It will be best practice to keep these addendums to the agreement to show that as of this day, this is your contractual obligation to do 2 days a week. As of this day, we're going to increase to 3 days, and so forth. this is good evidence for HMRC if there's an inquiry to show how many days they actually worked and how many days they were on furlough. But this comes to the calculation, and as I said, the calculation is changing as of the 1st of July. And in the past, the calculation was based on the number of days the employees on furlough as compared to the number of days in the calendar month. Quite a straightforward calculation. You prorate the number of days, you apply this to the furlough calculation, the wage, relatively straightforward. As of the 1st of July, this becomes a lot more complex, and there's a new terminology which we have to bear in mind called the usual worked hours, or usual hours worked. Now, the usual hours worked is effectively HMRC's calculation of what the employees' contractual hours would have been. So to give you an example, and in a very simplistic view, if you start with someone on a fixed salary, they may have been working on a contractual basis 40 hours a week. That would be their usual hours worked on a weekly basis. But we need to work out that same figure for the month. Now, as I say, an employee who's on a fixed salary contract, it's probably quite obvious what their contractual hours would be. If they state in the contract that they're contracted to work 40 hours a week, it could be 35 hours a week if you're not paying them for the hour lunch break. There might be some complications here if you state that the hours of work are between 9 and 5 and don't state whether they are being paid for their hour lunch break or not. And this is something where there's going to be some real niggles to deal with. But in essence, it's quite straightforward to work out what the contractual hours would have been for an employee. And again, as with everything to do with furlough, this is based on their contractual hours prior to the 19th of March 2020. For those employees who are on more of a flexible or variable hourly contract, such as those in the retail and hospitality industry, this becomes a lot more complex. Similar to the furlough calculation previously, you can use one of 2 or 3 different ways. In essence, you look at the average hours worked across the entire tax period for 1920, or the equivalent hours worked in the same period as the furlough period. You're looking at the pay period you're looking at this time last year. So, for example, across the entire period for 1920, they might have worked on average 21 hours a week. But in July last year, it might have been a very busy period, and they might have worked on average 40 hours a week. You can therefore use the 40-hour a week contract to work out the usual hours worked. This has to be done per employee rather than on a global basis. So if you're, again, if you've got multiple employees on a variable hour contract, this can be quite a messy and complex task, but something that needs to be done under these flexible furlough arrangements. Once you have the usual hours, or the contracted hours worked in a week, you divide this by the repeating working pattern. And for most of you, this is going to be a 7-day working week. You include the weekend in that. There are companies out there who pay employees. You might employ someone 4 days on, 4 days off, 4 days on, 4 days off, in which they've got an 8-day working pattern. But for most of you, we're going to use 7 days here. And then multiply that by the number of days in the month. So we can use a really simple example, which HMRC has given for a fixed hour contract. So an employee who's worked for F Limited since 2016, working 40 hours a week on a monthly salary of £3,000 paid calendar monthly. The employee was furloughed on the 20th of April, and for the 1st of July is asked to return to work half days. Pay has been topped up, and there is no bonus commission or any other additional pay. So we take our 40 hours, the contractual weekly hours the employee was required to work, divide that by 7, which is the number of days in the repeating working pattern, and you multiply it by 31 for the number of days in July to get 178 usual hours worked, rounded up. Always round up to the nearest hour. Now, this is just the starting point of these calculations. As I say, this is this usual hours worked, and it's basically HMRC's estimate of the number of hours that they would have worked in July, August, and so forth. Now, complications arise because of this, because if you think about the number of actual days in July, there's 23 working days in July. And at 8 hours a day, which is 40 hours a week, divided by 5, on an 8-hour day basis, that effectively equates to 184 hours in the month of July. So there is this tit for tat where, in essence, there would be this underpay in July. But again, if you did the same calculation for August, the number of actual working hours in the month of August is 168 working hours. So there is this benefit in August, but a kind of cost in July. And what does this mean? I mean, this is just the starting point of this calculation, and it's just showing what we need to then work out how many hours the employee has been furloughed. Because rather than prorate the period as based on how many hours have worked in, or across the working week or the actual month, we have to start with this usual hours and then use this as a basis to determine how many hours the employee has been on furlough. And that's pretty straightforward. We take the number of hours the employee has actually worked in the period, deducted from the usual hours to work out the number of hours they've been furloughed. Effectively, the number of hours on furlough is the residue. So using the government's example, from the 1st of July, the employee was asked to return to work on a half-day basis. So we know 4 hours a day they've been working. There's 23 working days in July. That works out to 92 working hours. So we take the 178, deduct the 92, and gets us 86 furloughed hours for this period. Now, of course, you can see the employee being asked to work half day. So you'd expect it to be 50% of the number of hours worked. Well, 86 is not 50% of 178. So this is showing you the offset of this HMRC using this estimate of 178 rather than the actual number of worked hours. And unfortunately, this is what we have to follow following the guidelines. Obviously, for July, it works out to 86 furloughed hours, which is less than half. But if you use the same example for August, there's 21 working days in August, which equates to 84 hours worked. So you would end up 94 furloughed hours in the month of August. So again, whilst they lose out in July, there'll be a benefit in August, assuming the employee is still in the same way. The other thing you have to bear in mind is the time frame of these worked hours. So if you're putting an employee on a 2 days a week working basis, you then have to look at what 2 days they are. 1st of July comes into effect from Wednesday. So are they working Wednesday, Thursday every week? Or do they work Monday, Tuesday, in which case the 3 days, that only equates to 8 days in the month. Whereas if they're working Wednesday, Thursday, you're going to have this extra week and you'd have 10 days worked in this month. So just bear in mind that really you have to be quite precise about the number of hours and number of days the employee has worked. Then the next part of the calculation is relatively straightforward. As before, the furlough pay is equal to the lesser of 80% of the usual wage, or £2,500 prorated over the furlough period. In this example, furlough period is the entire month. So the employee was paid £3,000 at 80%. That's 2,400, which is less than the £2,500 cap. So we take the 2,400, we multiply that by the 86 furloughed hours, and you divide that by the 178 usual hours worked, which gives you the £1,160 furlough rebate. This would be the rebate for the company and effectively the employee's additional salary for the month. So you can look at this and say, well, the employee is going to get an actual salary of 50% of their wage, which is £1,500. And on top of that, this furlough rebate of £1,160, which doesn't really equate to 50% of the 80% of the 50% that's remaining. Again, in August, they would end up with using the same calculation because it's 178 usual hours worked in August, because we're still looking at a 31-day pay period. This calculation would be £2,400 times by 94 furloughed hours in August, divided by the 178 usual hours would give you £1,267. So the employee would be about £107 better off in August as opposed to July. And Again, this doesn't impact the company because the company's getting that money back as a rebate. Now, don't forget the national insurance pension contributions, because these calculations also have changed. Again, in the past, you would take the national insurance for the entire pay period and you'd rate that across the between the furlough pay and the non-furlough pay. In this example, we start with the furlough rebate amount, which we've just calculated. We deduct from that the de minimis limits, so the secondary threshold for NIC or the lower level of qualified earnings for pensions, and we prorate those to the de minimis limits by the number of furloughed hours divided by the number of usual hours. I'm not going to go into the calculations here because, as they can be complex, quite messy, but there's examples of the fact that actually those calculations have changed as well. So that really shows you what's changing from July and how they can get quite messy. As I say, if you've got employees who are on a variable wage, you're going to have to do this per employee, and just bear in mind that the usual hours worked are not going to be the same for everyone. For those people on a fixed, standard salary paid, monthly, this could be relatively straightforward, but again, there's far more complexity to these calculations than there were before. The other thing you can bear in mind is that with this being a flexible furlough arrangement, you can really play the number of hours that they work on and off. That you can bring the employees back and put them back on furlough, take them off furlough. There's much more flexibility as of the 1st of July than there was previously. There's no longer this this minimum period of furlough, and there's a lot more flexibility around that. But obviously, just keep in mind that these changes will impact the calculations, and can take time and be quite a burden. So what else is changing thereafter? From August, employers have the ability to pay. The employers will have to pay the employers the national insurance and pension contributions for furloughed staff. So same as before, you have this flexible furlough arrangement, but from August, you're going to have to pay the NIC, and you're also going to have to pay the pension contributions. So there's a bit more of a cost to the business. From September, you're going to have to pay the employer's national insurance and employer's pension contributions. You won't get the rebates, as I said before. But in addition to that, you're going to have to top up the employees with this 10%. The rebate is being reduced to 70%. So to use the example we had before, an employee is paid £3,000 a month on average. Let's say they're furloughed for the whole period, make things life a lot easier. They're entitled to their 80%, which is the £2,000. However, the furlough rebate will be capped at 70%. So in that example, the rebate to the company would be £2,100, and you as an employer would have to pay the £300 difference. So it's going to cost the company additional. It's going to make an additional cost to the company from December onwards to keep an employee on furlough. And then in October, this rebate reduces to 60%, and so it's going to cost a further £300 or £600 in total to keep an employee on furlough in October. The scheme will close at the end of October. Now, the scheme has been extended, I think, 3 times now. We're not expecting to see this extend again. I would be very surprised. They're doing this tapering to make sure, to encourage people to go back to work. Obviously, we don't know if there's a second wave, what impact that could happen, but for all intents and purposes, we would expect the scheme to be closed at the end of October. So brings us on to some questions we have here, some questions that have been raised prior to the webinar. As employees return to work, what is the position regarding non-discretionary overtime payments? If they're paid overtime at rates set out in the contract for extra hours worked over their standard 7 hours, does this impact the furlough claim? So this is a really important question, actually, and if you go back to our example of the working out the furloughed hours, the furloughed hours are equal to the usual hours worked less the actual hours worked in that period. So, for example, if an employee does overtime during the furlough, this flexible furlough period, let's say July, well, that's just going to increase the number of hours they've worked and decrease their furlough rebate. So in actual fact, there's little encouragement for an employee to do overtime in the month of July, as this is not going to increase, the furlough rebate would actually reduce. Obviously, as a company, you can make the discretionary choice to pay them a bonus for those hours, or to come to an arrangement with the employee whereby they are benefiting from those extra hours worked. But from a furlough rebate perspective, you will be getting less of a rebate because technically they've worked more hours in that month. That being said, an employee who works non-discretionary overtime and has been paid non-discretionary overtime in the past would likely have a higher number of contractual hours. When we work out our contractual hours and that usual hours worked of 178, we start with that 40-hour contractual rate. And then for those employees who are on a variable rate, so the employees where there is likely to be a non-discretionary overtime, they might be working 50 hours, 60 hours a week. So you would start with that figure to work out your usual hours worked, in which case you're going to start with a much higher number of usual hours worked for that month of July than you would have done for an employee who was working there 9 to 5, 8 hours a day on that 178 basis. So whilst they're not going to get that paid for their overtime, they probably would have a much larger furlough rebate in any case because of the number of hours they actually worked previously. Second question here is, we called one of our employees who was furloughed and asked for the location of a software program that we needed. The employee said that he couldn't tell the answer because he wasn't supposed to be doing anything that would allow the company to make money. Were we wrong in asking this question? I get this question a lot as to what you can and can't do whilst on furlough. So whilst on furlough, an employee cannot do anything that's going to generate money for the business or provide a service to the business. By generate money, this is quite a loose term, but from all the kind of guidance and information I've read, I would expect this term to be more likely to be directly generating money. So by finding the software or telling the company where the software is located, it's not doing anything to actually generate funds for the business. Yes, with that software in hand, the company could then go and generate money, but there's no guarantee of that. And therefore, I wouldn't say that is doing anything to generate money for the business. Likewise, providing a service is going to be something like providing marketing services, accounting services, support, HR, administration. Telling someone where the location of a software is not going to be providing a service to the company. So in this scenario, really the company is not wrong for asking this question. The employee is required to provide information contractually, probably, and there is just keep in mind that so long as the employee is not providing a service to the business and not generating funds for the business, then you are able to communicate with that employee. Final question here is, if employees are not working some of the days, do they still receive the same amount of furlough they were getting previously? For example, if they work 3 days and the company pays them for those 3 days, and the 2 days are not working, will furlough be paid, and it's the same amount of furlough they were already receiving? Well, as we discussed before, it's not that straightforward. In the past, if you were working 3/5 of the month, if you were on furlough for 3/5 of the month, you would apportion the month by 3/5, and you apply the furlough to the 2/5. Relatively straightforward, trying to give an example there. Now it's based on the number of hours. So it's going to depend on those usual hours worked. And we've already seen for the month of July, this is likely to result in a slightly less furlough rebate in the month of July and slightly more in August. So if you use the same 3/5, 2/5 example, the employee will probably have slightly less income in July, but slightly more in August. So that's the end of our questions that we did in advance, and hopefully the calculation that you've seen. Please do write your questions, and I'll address those in a second. But there is, as I was trying to put across here, that complexity of the changes that come into effect from July are things that need to be in mind, because the calculations are no longer as straightforward as they once were, and this is really going to create some questions. And we've already seen this from the last webinar, where we've had some really good questions about how to do these calculations, and we'll go through your questions now. So let me just bear with me. Unmute Joe. Joe, you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Ben. Hi. Okay, so
Do we have any?
yeah, we do. I've got one question here. If we have more than one employee who can do the same job, but only enough work for one of them, can we rotate them so one, say, does 2 days, the other does 3, or do we have to get one employee back full time on that basis? I'm not unsure about the flexibility.
So that's a good question. It's really up to you. As an employer, it's very flexible what you can and can't do from 1st of July. In the past, people have been using the 3 week on, 3 week off rotation. So from March to June, what a lot of employees have been doing is they've been taking someone off of furlough for 3 weeks, whilst the other employees on furlough for 3 weeks, and then swapping them over every 3 weeks. You don't need to do that anymore. You can do it daily, hourly if you want to, but reality is there's a lot more flexibility from 1st of July, and you can bring an employee. You can share a role between 2 employees, so that one does half the day and the other does the other half, and however you want to. In reality, but I would say, as before, make sure that there is a contract in place which kind of stipulates this. So it shows that you are being fair, and also that you are noting down what they are actually working.
Okay. And we have another question here, which is from Anonymous, but we'll answer this one live. So I understand HMRC will have an updated calculator online. Is this an accurate or foolproof way of checking calculations going forwards? And I know I can see why you're smiling.
Okay, so HMRC has had, to give you kind of an example of this, when the furlough scheme first came out, HMRC announced they had this calculator online. The calculator could do the most simple scenarios. Didn't take into account anything like holiday pay, into account any salary sacrifices. It didn't even take into account where the calculation were you to top up the pay for the full 100%. They adapted that slowly over time, but still now their calculator doesn't take into account a number of issues which is likely to affect most businesses. I would use the online calculator with real reverence in terms of if you have a very simple, straightforward scenario, then the calculator may be suitable for you. And if you do use the calculator, make sure you take a screenshot of that calculation, have that on file for any justification for an HMRC inquiry, because they are accepting that their calculator isn't foolproof and isn't complete, really, and have said that if you use the calculator, then we would accept that as a justification, again, on simple scenarios. And I've said a couple of examples, but I want to go into that in more detail, because this impacted the previous furlough scheme, and also impacts the new flexible arrangements. So holiday pay is a real area where there's been a lot of questions. Holiday pay, if you're employing an employee holiday, they are entitled to their holiday pay at their full rate of pay. So if they're on that 80% reduced amount, then you have to, as an employer, top them up to 20%. It's very recommended that they take the holiday during their furlough period, because then all you're doing is paying that 20% difference. If they take a holiday pay when they come back, when they come back from furlough, then you're having to pay the entire amount of their wages at the full rate. So you might want to consider forcing people to take holiday during their furlough period, and something to look at. But again, this will impact the calculation and how much you pay them. The other thing is salary sacrifice. And this is things like pension contributions, childcare vouchers. Salary sacrifice is an area where the revenue don't talk a huge amount about, but it does impact the claim quite considerably. When a furlough, one of the major things about the furlough rebate is that the full amount of the rebate must go to the employee. Now, if you look at the salary sacrifice scheme where someone is paid a £3,000 salary, sacrifices, let's say £150 for pension contributions each month, they are effectively getting £2,850 in their pocket. Under the furlough scheme, you would use that. You would use the £3,000 as the calculation, but when they get their furlough rebate, that must be after the salary sacrifice. So let's say the furlough rebate is £2,500, to give an example. They should be entitled to getting a £2,650 salary, so that after that £150 deduction, they get the £2,500. So again, this is the cost to the business, which needs to be taken into mind. So these are the type of things that the calculator doesn't take into account, and really the complexities of some of these calculations, which need to be made aware by employers.
Okay.
I've got another question here, which is asked previously to this, and it's something just to highlight. So we talked about usual hours worked, and it's really an important part of this new flexible furlough calculation, and how to calculate that for employees who are on a flexible, variable or fixed salary. But if you have an employee who doesn't have a contract, doesn't have an agreement, for example, a director of a business, how do we determine what their actual hours worked are? And this is something, again, there is no guidance of, but I wanted to highlight this because it can be an area where there is complexity, and I think an area where there is definitely a judgment. For those employers who are furloughing directors and have employees who are working on a fixed rate of 40 hours a week, contractual rate of 40 hours a week, I would say it would be reasonable to assume that the directors are on the same contractual rate as the employees. For those where there is just the directors being furloughed and there's no other employees, then I think you're going to have to take a judgment call of 35 or 40-hour contractual week, which is a standard weekly rate, unless you have any notes or any anything that you can show to justify less or more hours. I think this is really important. You keep documentation here to be able to justify the hours worked in those scenarios if there was ever an HMRC inquiry.
Okay. All right, Ben. Well, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our webinar. We will make a recording of this available on the website later on today. Thanks very much for the questions that have come through. Thanks very much, Ben. And we look forward to our next one.
Thank you, everyone.